The ruin is one of the most typical and interesting of Old English poems. It illustrates practically every theme and many of the techniques that we're going to be discussing throughout the term, especially when we talk about Old English poetry. Notice, for instance, the opening phrases. Wondrous is this wall stone. Here, the translator is trying to give you a sense of the use of alliteration in Old English poetry. Old English poetry did not rhyme. Instead, the poets used alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds, to tie the words together and make them more memorable. But no sooner does the poem begin with this exclamation that the wall stone is wondrous, than it immediately jumps to the ruin of this wall stone. It has been broken by fate, the castles have decayed, the work of giants is crumbling. That sudden shift from something positive to something negative is very typical of Old English poetry. This is a poetry full of irony, and one of the most effective ways in which you can convey irony in this poetry is through a technique called juxtaposition, which is literally where you jam opposites together without any kind of smooth transition. So right where you have the semicolon in the first sentence, you have a wonderful example of juxtaposition. On the left side of the semicolon, we have a very positive statement. On the right side of the semicolon, we have a whole series of very negative statements. In fact, that use of a series is referred to as variation. It's a repetition of the same basic idea, but in each case, the repetition is going to be slightly different. It's going to be emphasizing a slightly different aspect of whatever is being emphasized. For instance, broken by fate sounds like a very sudden, abrupt change. The castles have decayed implies a slower change, a much more gradual process of ruin. And finally, the third phrase, the work of giants is crumbling. That implies that the change, that the mutability is going on right before our very eyes, right in the present. So just in the case of that opening sentence, you have three different kinds of mutability being mentioned: abrupt mutability, mutability that takes place slowly over time, and mutability that is still ongoing right before our eyes, right in the present day. Notice some of the ironies that are already implied in that opening sentence. Why do we build castles? To protect ourselves, to keep our enemies out, to offer ourselves very secure shelter. What has happened? These castles have decayed. Old English people basically felt that nothing earthly would endure for very long. Nothing earthly will survive. If we move to the next sentence, we have what's called some assonance, where the poet is, or the translator rather, is trying to give us a sense of the repetition of vowel sounds when he says, roofs are fallen, ruinous are the towers. And in that case, you have not only assonance, the repetition of vowel sounds, but again, you have alliteration, the repetition of initial consonant sounds. Roofs are fallen, ruinous are the towers. But let's talk about the imagery that's being used here. Why do we build roofs? To protect ourselves from the elements. The most important feature of any home is in fact the roof. You can get by without windows. You can get by without walls. You can even in some cases get by without you can get by without windows and doors, and in some cases you can even get by without walls. But you really don't have a house if you don't have a roof. So this is a very radical statement. The roofs are fallen. The towers have been ruined. What is a tower? A tower is a symbol of human ability. It is an assertion in brick or mortar of human power and human might. These towers have been ruined. They have fallen down. Anybody who has ever watched the ruin of the towers, the Twin Towers in New York City in 2001, will be able to see how this is a very typical Old English perception, that even the most powerful symbols of our civilization and our culture are subject to very, very quick destruction. Despoiled are the towers with their gates. Why did they put gates in the towers? In order to protect themselves, in order to keep out the people they did not want coming in, and in order to allow into the tower the people that they did want to come in. Well, even the gates have now been destroyed. Frost is on their cement. Frost is, in any kind of reference to winter in Old English literature, is often an indication of the fallen state, the way the world exists after Adam and Eve ate the apple in the Garden of Eden. It's also just actually a very accurate description of the climate that these people had to deal with. It was not a tropical climate. It was not Miami Beach. It was often a very cold and uninviting climate. So frost is usually, excuse me, and any kind of reference to winter is often used as a symbol of just how hard it is to live in this world, this fallen world, this so-called post-lapsarian world, the world after the fall. The roofs are broken. Again, the most fundamental part of any structure has been destroyed. Those roofs have been cut away, fallen, undermined by age. So once again, we have the technique of variation in which three different ways of describing something are used, partly for emphasis, partly to indicate that any of these processes is not simple. It's a complex process. And also remember that Old English poetry is oral poetry, so it's being recited by someone before a live audience. And so this is another reason that the Old English poets like to use variation. It gives them an opportunity to emphasize a key point without simply being repetitive, because each new addition to the emphasis is emphasizing a slightly different aspect of whatever is being stressed. The grasp of the earth, stout grip of the ground. And here the translator is really trying to give you a very strong sense of the alliteration that is typical of Old English poetry. The grasp, the grip, the ground, that kind of sound is typical of the music of Old English poetry. Again, they don't use rhyme, but they use a lot of alliteration. In fact, every single line of Old English poetry has alliteration. So the grasp of the earth, stout grip of the ground, holds its mighty builders. Talk about irony. The people who once manipulated the earth to build these structures are now themselves part of the earth. They're no longer mighty. They may have been when they were alive, but ironically now the mighty builders have been swallowed up by the earth. They have perished and gone. That's a typical keynote theme of Old English poetry. That's a very explicit statement of mutability. Nothing remains the same here on earth. Everything is constantly changing, and usually it's changing for the worse. Till now, 100 generations of men have died. Mutability is not simply something that affects us. It has affected everyone throughout the entire history of the planet. And excuse me, it will continue to affect everyone who will ever exist on Earth. Often this wall, gray with lichen and stained with red. Notice the colorlessness implied by the reference to gray with lichen. Even the moss is gray. Even the moss seems lifeless. But the wall has also been stained with red, maybe suggesting blood stains, maybe suggesting a contrasting color of lichen. In any case, you have a very strong contrast there between gray, which is a very boring color, and red, which is a very powerful color. Unmoved under storms. Storms are a very, very common symbol in Old English poetry of mutability because they are completely unpredictable, they are chaotic, they're powerful, we fear them, and they're a perfect example of the kind of change, negative change, that we have to put up with in our lives. But this wall has survived kingdom after kingdom. That sounds good, but then notice what immediately happens. Another example of juxtaposition. Its lofty gate has fallen. And then we have 3 dots indicating that the single manuscript in which this poem is preserved, and almost all Old English poetry is preserved in just one surviving manuscript. Even Beowulf exists in only one manuscript, which was nearly destroyed by fire in the 18th century. But in this case, in the case of the manuscript of the ruin, the manuscript itself is a kind of ruin. Something has happened. Maybe a bookworm, literally a bookworm, has chewed through the manuscript at that point. Maybe there's just a tear in it. In any case, the interesting thing is that the poem about ruins is itself a kind of exemplification of what it's talking about. The bold in spirit. Notice how the poet is about to fake us out here, which Old English poets love to do. The bold in spirit bound the foundation of the wall wondrously together with wires. They went out of their way to make sure that this wall would never decay. And yet what has happened? It has decayed. No matter how hard we as humans try to defeat mutability or to prevent mutability, mutability always wins in the end, at least here on earth. Bright were the castle dwellings, many the bathhouses, lofty the host of pinnacles, great the tumult of men, many a mead hall full of the joys of men. There's a wonderful example of variation, just repeatedly emphasizing over and over and over again how great life was back when this city was in existence. But watch again what happens. No sooner do we have all this emphasis on the former greatness of the city than we have another example of juxtaposition, till fate, the mighty, overturned that. The word fate here is almost certainly a translation of the Old English word weird, W-Y-R-D, which simply means what happens. None of us can control what will happen in our lives. The only thing we have control over is how we respond to what happens. But no matter what we invest our time and effort and energy in, it will eventually be destroyed. Everything will eventually become a ruin. Excuse me, I have a cough as a result of a recent operation. The wide walls fell. Days of pestilence came. Now notice what's implied here. Not only are the physical walls being destroyed, but human beings have died. And they've died in a very painful way. It's not as if they were suddenly cut down and died in an instant. Instead, they suffered from disease. In a sense, they died from the inside out. Death swept away all the bravery of men. It doesn't matter how brave you are, you will eventually die. Their fortresses became waste places. Again, a nice example of juxtaposition. The word fortresses implies power and security, but no sooner are the fortresses mentioned than we're told that they became waste places. The city fell to ruin. So here's the theme of mutability being emphasized very explicitly once again. Now, this is a very nice example of how this Old English poet leads us to expect one thing and then gives us something completely different. The multitudes who might have built it anew lay dead on the earth. So they love to do that. They love to use that kind of irony. They create a sense of hope and then they dash that hope. Wherefore these courts are in decay and these lofty gates. The woodwork of the roof is stripped of tiles. So it's bad enough that this city has been destroyed just by the passage of time and perhaps by the elements of the weather. But there's a real possibility that humans have come along and stripped the tiles away. The place has sunk into ruin, leveled to the hills. And then again, watch how nicely the poet uses some nice irony here. I always love these kinds of passages. Where in times past many a man, light of heart and bright with gold, adorned with splendors, proud and flushed with wine, shone in war trappings, gazed on treasure, on silver, on precious stones, on riches, on possessions, on costly gems, on this bright castle of the broad kingdom. So he takes us back into time and he shows us how this place was once a very lively, vital place in which human beings were really enjoying their lives. They were drinking wine. They were looking at all the gold they had covered, all the gold that they had accumulated. These are people in the prime of life, and now what has happened to them? They're all dead. Stone courts stood here. Again, not wooden courts, stone courts. Courts designed to withstand mutability. The stream with its great gush sprang forth hotly. This poem, I should have mentioned earlier, is almost certainly a poem about the British city of Bath, as the Brits like to call it, or Bath, as we Americans call it. I once had a British student correct my pronunciation and insist that we should call it Bath. In any case, the city of Bath or Bath was and still is, a very, very impressive city. If you ever have a chance to go to England, make sure you go there, because you'll see that the Romans had constructed this incredibly impressive habitation built around hot springs where hot water was just bubbling up out of the ground. And so one of the great features of the Roman structure there is literally this bath, this hot bath, where the Romans would go to relax, go to clean themselves, and it's almost as if Earth had provided them with something special, something that was almost a way of helping them to overcome the hardness of their lives. And yet what has happened? Even this very special place is now deserted. Even it has fallen into a state of ruin. The wall enclosed all within its bright bosom. That's a very interesting word. Of course, we're dealing here with the translation, as we're always dealing with translations in Old English poetry, unless we know Old English. But what a wonderfully chosen word. It's almost as if this place was once their mother, holding them tight to her bosom. There the baths were hot in its center. Again, what a wonderfully unexpected thing to find this place where hot water is just bubbling up out of the earth. That was spacious. And then the poem just ends very abruptly, almost certainly because something has happened to the manuscript at this point. Usually an Old English poem would emphasize the inevitability of decay, the inevitability of mutability, the inevitability of death, and then it would eventually evolve towards consoling us, giving us hope that there is a God, there is a place in heaven for us potentially. Heaven is much better than anything we could ever imagine on earth. Heaven is a place where mutability no longer exists, where suffering, pain no longer exists. You can see why the Old English would be very attracted to Christianity, because it seemed to offer them a hope that when they died, they would live in a very, very happy and joyous and loving place. So that's the ruin. It's a very nice example of so many of the most important themes and techniques of Old English poetry, especially, again, the theme of mutability. I apologize for my cough. Ironically, the medicine that was supposed to help me deal with my operation actually gave me a cough, which, as it turns out, has been even worse than the operation, which wasn't bad at all. It was heart surgery. And if you ever have to have heart surgery, trust me, it's not as painful as you imagine. As I say, the worst part of it for me has been this cough, which has developed within the last couple of weeks, and I'm hoping it's going away. Thanks very much for listening to this talk about the ruin, and now we're going to move on to some other Old English literature.